My name is Jessica Martinez, and I'm 29 years old. I never imagined that a simple family vacation announcement would completely shatter the illusion I'd been living under for nearly 3 years. When my mother casually informed me that I'd need to contribute $6,500 to join the family trip to Cabo, while my unemployed brother Tyler got his expenses covered, something inside me finally clicked into place. That's when I looked her straight in the eye and said the words that would change everything. Interesting, considering I've been bankrolling Tyler's entire lifestyle while he pretends to be broke. The stunned silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, but it was nothing compared to the earthquake of revelations that would follow. What started as a conversation about vacation expenses turned into the most brutal awakening of my adult life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Martinez family's Sunday dinners had been a tradition for as long as I could remember. Every week, David and I would drive from our downtown Phoenix condo to my parents' sprawling Scottsdale home, where the smell of my mother's famous enchiladas would greet us before we even rang the doorbell. These gatherings were supposed to be about family connection, catching up on everyone's week and maintaining the close bonds that had always defined our family. At least that's what I thought they were about, until everything fell apart. Growing up in Phoenix, with Tyler, had been like living with someone who existed in a completely different reality than the rest of us. While our parents, Bob and Linda, had raised us with strong values about hard work and responsibility, somehow those lessons never quite took hold with my older brother. Even as kids, the differences between us were stark. I was the one who got up early to deliver newspapers to save money for the things I wanted, while Tyler would sleep until noon and then complain that he never had any spending money. Our parents always had an excuse ready for Tyler's behavior. He was more creative than practical, they'd say. He was a free spirit who just needed time to find his path. He was sensitive and required more understanding than other kids his age. Meanwhile, I was praised for being so mature and responsible, but somehow that praise always came with additional expectations. Since I was so good at managing things, surely I wouldn't mind helping out when Tyler needed support. The pattern established itself early and only intensified as we moved into adulthood. While I worked multiple part-time jobs throughout high school and saved every penny for college, Tyler drifted through his senior year with barely passing grades and no concrete plans for the future. When graduation came, I had earned enough scholarships and saved enough money to attend Arizona State University without putting any financial burden on our parents. Tyler, on the other hand, enrolled in community college with grand plans to transfer to a 4-year university, but dropped out after 1 semester because the coursework was too restrictive for his creative process. I threw myself into my studies at ASU, majoring in digital marketing while working nights at a local restaurant to cover my living expenses. The work was exhausting, but I felt proud knowing that I was building my future through my own efforts. I graduated summa cum laude and immediately landed a position with a growing tech company in Tempe. Within 2 years, I had been promoted to senior marketing coordinator, and by my 27th birthday, I was earning a comfortable salary that allowed me to buy my own condo and start building real financial security. Tyler's path looked drastically different. After dropping out of community college, he bounced between various jobs, none of which seemed to last more than a few months. There was the stint at a local restaurant that ended when he got into an argument with the manager about scheduling flexibility. Then came the retail job at an electronics store that he quit because he felt the commission structure was unfair. Each departure was accompanied by elaborate explanations about how the workplace was toxic or how his supervisors failed to appreciate his unique skills and perspective. Around the time I turned 25, Tyler announced that he was going to become an entrepreneur. He had big dreams about starting his own food truck business, convinced that Phoenix's growing food scene was the perfect opportunity for someone with his creativity and vision. The initial investment required was substantial, but Tyler assured our parents that he had done extensive research and had a comprehensive business plan that would guarantee success. Our parents were skeptical at first, but Tyler's enthusiasm was infectious. He spent weeks showing them market research, potential locations, and projected profit margins. He talked about how this would finally be his chance to prove himself and become financially independent. When they expressed concerns about the $15,000 investment required to purchase and outfit the truck, Tyler reminded them of all the money they had spent on my college education and suggested that this was simply his version of investing in his future. The emotional manipulation was subtle, but effective. Tyler painted himself as someone who had been overlooked and undervalued, someone who just needed one real opportunity to show what he was capable of achieving. He made our parents feel guilty for not believing in him and convinced them that their support would be the foundation for his transformation into a successful business owner. I watched this unfold with a mixture of skepticism and hope. Part of me genuinely wanted Tyler to succeed, both for his own sake and for our parents, who had been supporting him financially in various ways since high school graduation. If the food truck business actually worked, maybe Tyler would finally develop the work ethic and independence that had been missing from his life up to that point. The food truck venture lasted exactly 4 months. According to Tyler, the failure had nothing to do with his work ethic or business acumen. Instead, he blamed the city's permitting process, the competition from established restaurants, and the customers who didn't understand his unique culinary vision. The truck was repossessed, leaving our parents out the full $15,000 and Tyler back to square one. But Tyler wasn't discouraged. Within weeks of the food truck failure, he had discovered a new passion for cryptocurrency trading. He spent hours watching YouTube videos and reading online forums, becoming convinced that he could make a fortune by day trading digital currencies. This new venture required a smaller initial investment, only $5,000, which Tyler argued was practically nothing compared to the potential returns. Our parents were more hesitant this time, but Tyler had learned from his previous pitch. He didn't just ask for money. He framed it as an opportunity for the whole family to benefit from his newfound expertise. He would start with $5,000, and once he had proven his system worked, he could help our parents invest their retirement savings and generate significant returns for everyone. The cryptocurrency experiment lasted even less time than the food truck. Within 6 weeks, Tyler had lost the entire investment through a series of increasingly desperate trades. Once again, the failure was attributed to external factors beyond his control. The market had been manipulated by big investors, he explained. The timing had been unlucky. The platforms were designed to favor institutional traders over individual investors like himself. Around this time, I started dating David, who worked as a software engineer for a different tech company in the Phoenix area. David was methodical and analytical by nature, traits that served him well in his profession, and that I had come to appreciate in our relationship. He was also an excellent observer of human behavior, and it didn't take him long to notice the unusual dynamics within my family. David never criticized my family directly, but he would ask thoughtful questions that made me examine situations from different perspectives. When Tyler announced his next entrepreneurial venture, a YouTube channel focused on lifestyle and motivational content, David quietly wondered how someone could consistently fail at business ventures without ever seeming to learn from previous mistakes. The YouTube channel represented Tyler's most ambitious project yet. He envisioned preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Creating content that would inspire other young people to pursue their dreams and build successful lives. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I tried to be supportive when Tyler explained his vision during one of our family dinners. He had studied successful YouTubers and believed he understood the formula for viral content and audience building. The financial requirements for this venture were more complex than his previous efforts. Tyler needed professional video equipment, editing software, a dedicated workspace, and marketing budget to promote his initial content. The total investment came to $8,000, which Tyler argued was modest compared to the potential revenue from sponsorships and advertising once his channel gained traction. Our parents had grown more cautious after the previous failures, but Tyler had refined his approach once again. This time, he positioned the request not as a handout, but as a loan with specific repayment terms. He would pay back the full amount within 1 year, with interest, once his channel reached monetization thresholds and started generating consistent income. I found myself getting pulled into these financial discussions for the first time. Our parents asked my opinion about Tyler's business plan, presumably because of my background in marketing. I tried to be honest but supportive, explaining that building a successful YouTube channel required consistency, unique content, and often years of work before generating significant income. Tyler dismissed my concerns as pessimism and argued that my experience in traditional marketing didn't apply to the new economy of social media and influencer culture. The YouTube channel produced exactly 12 videos over the course of 3 months before Tyler abandoned the project. He claimed that the platform's algorithm was biased against new creators, and that building an audience was impossible without insider connections to other successful YouTubers. The $8,000 had been spent on equipment that now sat unused in Tyler's apartment, serving as an expensive reminder of another failed venture. It was around this time that my role in Tyler's financial support became more direct and personal. Previously, our parents had been the primary source of funding for his various projects and living expenses, but Tyler was approaching 30, and even our patient and supportive parents were starting to feel the strain of continuously supporting an adult child who showed no signs of achieving independence. The first request came during a family barbecue at our parents' house. Tyler pulled me aside while David was helping our father with the grill and explained that he was going through a temporary rough patch. His latest part-time job had ended unexpectedly, and he was behind on rent by $600. He would normally ask our parents for help, but he knew they were still recovering financially from his previous business investments, and he didn't want to add to their stress. Tyler assured me that this was a one-time emergency, and that he had several promising job interviews lined up. He would pay me back within 2 weeks, as soon as he started earning income again. The amount seemed manageable, and I appreciated that Tyler seemed to be taking responsibility for his situation rather than expecting our parents to solve his problems. 2 weeks turned into a month, and when I gently reminded Tyler about the repayment, he explained that the job interviews hadn't worked out as expected, but that he had new leads that looked even more promising. He seemed genuinely embarrassed about not being able to pay me back on schedule, and assured me that he would have the money within another few weeks. The $600 was never repaid, but I tried not to dwell on it. Tyler was family, and family helped each other during difficult times. I had been fortunate in my career, and could afford to help when others were struggling. Besides, Tyler seemed to be making genuine efforts to find steady employment and turn his life around. The second request came 3 months later. This time, Tyler needed $900 to cover car repairs that were essential for his job search. Without reliable transportation, he explained, he couldn't get to interviews or maintain employment once he found work. The logic seemed sound, and I wanted to support Tyler's efforts to become more independent. The pattern continued and accelerated over the following months. There was always another emergency, another unexpected expense, another temporary setback that required financial assistance. Tyler's requests were always framed as loans with specific repayment timelines, but somehow the repayment dates would come and go without any acknowledgement or explanation. David began expressing concerns about what he saw as a troubling pattern. He pointed out that Tyler's emergencies seemed to coincide with times when he had posted photos on social media showing expensive purchases or entertainment activities. The car repair emergency, for example, had occurred the same week that Tyler had posted pictures from an expensive concert that featured VIP seating and premium drinks. I found myself making excuses for Tyler's behavior and defending the family dynamic to David. Tyler was going through a difficult period, I explained. Everyone needed help sometimes, and I was in a position to provide that help without significant hardship. The amounts involved weren't large enough to impact my own financial security, and maintaining family harmony was worth more than the money. But David's observations forced me to pay closer attention to the inconsistencies in Tyler's stories and behavior. I started noticing that Tyler's periods of supposed unemployment seemed to coincide with an active social life that included regular restaurant meals, entertainment events, and consumer purchases that would be difficult to afford on unemployment benefits alone. When I occasionally asked Tyler about these apparent contradictions, he had explanations ready. The concert tickets had been a gift from a friend. The restaurant meals were networking opportunities that might lead to job offers. The new clothes and gadgets were investments in his professional appearance and capabilities. These explanations were plausible enough that I didn't feel comfortable challenging them directly, but they left me with a growing sense of unease about the true nature of Tyler's financial situation. David's skepticism began to seem less like cynicism and more like reasonable concern based on observable evidence. The breaking point began to build during the early months of this year, when Tyler's requests for financial assistance became both more frequent and more substantial. What had started as occasional emergencies involving a few $100s had evolved into regular requests for amounts exceeding $1,000 each time. In January, Tyler needed $1,500 for what he described as a certification program that would qualify him for higher-paying positions in graphic design. In February, he required $1,200 to cover moving expenses after his landlord suddenly increased his rent. Each request came with detailed explanations and promises of repayment, but the previous loans remained unaddressed. By the time our parents announced the Cabo vacation plan during our February family dinner, I had loaned Tyler a total of $38,000 over the course of 2.5 years. Not a single payment had been made toward any of these loans, despite Tyler's consistent promises and my occasional gentle reminders about repayment schedules. The vacation announcement itself should have been exciting news. Our parents had been talking for years about taking a family trip somewhere tropical, and Cabo San Lucas represented the kind of luxury destination that would have been unthinkable when David and I were growing up. Our father had worked as an electrician for over 30 years before retiring, and our mother's part-time bookkeeping job had provided supplemental income but never extravagant luxuries. The fact that they were finally in a position to afford such a trip should have felt like a celebration of their hard work and careful financial planning throughout their careers. They had saved diligently, lived within their means, and reached a point in their lives where they could enjoy some of the experiences they had postponed while raising children and building careers. But the way the vacation was presented immediately raised red flags about the underlying family dynamics that I had been trying so hard to ignore. Rather than simply announcing their plans for a family trip, our parents framed the vacation as an opportunity that required financial contributions from everyone involved. The math didn't make sense from the beginning. According to our mother's explanation, the total cost for the week-long trip would be $26,000, which included flights, accommodation at a luxury resort, meals, and various activities. My portion of this total was calculated at $6,500, which seemed high, but not unreasonable for a high-end vacation package. What made no sense was Tyler's contribution, which was listed as $0. When I asked about this obvious discrepancy, our parents explained that Tyler was going through a particularly difficult time, and that they wanted to give him this opportunity to relax and reset before continuing his job search. The explanation was delivered with the same tone and reasoning that had justified every previous instance of special treatment for Tyler. He needed more support because his life was more challenging. He deserved help because he had been struggling for so long. The family could afford to cover his expenses because others were doing well financially. As I sat there listening to these familiar justifications, something finally shifted in my perspective. For the first time, I could see clearly how these conversations always followed the same script. Tyler's needs were presented as urgent and deserving of support. My financial stability was presented as a reason why I should contribute more, rather than receive consideration for my own sacrifices and contributions. David squeezed my hand under the table, and I could feel his support even as I struggled to process my growing anger and frustration. This wasn't just about the vacation expenses. This was about a family dynamic that had been operating for years without my full awareness or consent. I realized that I had been unconsciously subsidizing Tyler's lifestyle while being told that my contributions were temporary loans that would be repaid once he got back on his feet. Meanwhile, Tyler had never made any genuine effort to achieve the financial independence that would make repayment possible. Instead, he had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for extracting money from family members, while maintaining the fiction that he was actively working towards self-sufficiency. The vacation demand crystallized everything that had been wrong with our family's financial dynamics. Tyler would receive a $6,500 vacation as a gift, while I was expected to pay for my own participation in the same trip. This arrangement was presented as normal and reasonable, with the implicit understanding that questioning it would make me selfish and unsupportive. But I was no longer willing to accept these terms without challenge. The words came out before I had fully processed what I was going to say, but once they were spoken, there was no taking them back. Interesting, considering I've been bankrolling Tyler's entire lifestyle while he pretends to be broke. The silence that followed my statement was unlike anything I had ever experienced at a family gathering. It wasn't the comfortable quiet that sometimes settled over our dinner table when everyone was enjoying their food, or the peaceful pause that came when someone was searching for the right words to continue a pleasant conversation. This was the heavy, suffocating silence of people trying to process something that had fundamentally altered the atmosphere of the room. My mother's fork remained suspended halfway between her plate and her mouth, a piece of enchilada balanced precariously on the end. My father had stopped mid-chew, his expression frozen in a mixture of confusion and growing concern. Tyler, who had been scrolling through his phone with his usual air of detached indifference, now stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was a combination of shock, anger, and something that looked almost like fear. David's hand found mine under the table, offering silent support as I watched my family grapple with the implications of what I had just revealed. For years, I had protected Tyler's privacy by never discussing his financial requests with our parents, even when those requests had become increasingly frequent and substantial. I had maintained the fiction that whatever help I provided was a private matter between siblings, separate from the family's broader financial dynamics. But sitting there, being asked to contribute $6,500 to a vacation that Tyler would enjoy for free, I finally understood how thoroughly I had been manipulated. This wasn't just about one vacation or even about the $38,000 I had loaned over the past few years. This was about a carefully constructed system that positioned me as the family's primary source of financial support, while maintaining the illusion that Tyler was simply unlucky rather than deliberately irresponsible. My mother was the first to recover enough to speak, though her voice came out smaller and more uncertain than usual. "Jessica, what exactly are you talking about? Tyler hasn't asked us for money in months." The statement revealed so much about how effectively Tyler had managed to compartmentalize his financial manipulation. Our parents genuinely believed that Tyler had become more financially independent recently, not because he had found steady employment or developed better money management skills, but because he had shifted his requests away from them and toward me. Tyler finally set down his phone and attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Jess, I think you're making this sound like something it's not. I've borrowed money from you a few times when I was really struggling, but I've always intended to pay you back. These were emergencies, not some kind of systematic thing." His tone was carefully calibrated to sound reasonable and slightly hurt, as if my characterization of our financial relationship was both inaccurate and unfairly harsh. It was a masterful performance that demonstrated just how skilled Tyler had become at managing other people's perceptions of his behavior. But I was no longer willing to participate in the performance. "Tyler, in the past 2.5 years, you have asked me for money 37 separate times. The amounts have ranged from $300 to $1,000 per request. You have never made a single payment toward any of these loans, despite promising specific repayment dates for every single one." The precision of my response seemed to catch Tyler off guard. He had clearly expected me to respond emotionally rather than factually, giving him room to dismiss my concerns as overreaction or misunderstanding. Instead, I had presented concrete information that was difficult to dispute or reframe. My father cleared his throat and attempted to mediate what he apparently viewed as a simple misunderstanding between his children. "Now, I'm sure this is something you two can work out between yourselves. Jessica, maybe Tyler could set up some kind of payment plan to address these loans." The suggestion revealed how little our parents understood about the true nature of the situation. They were treating this as if it were a simple matter of miscommunication that could be resolved through better organization and clear expectations. They had no comprehension of the systematic manipulation that had been taking place, or their own role in creating the conditions that made such manipulation possible. I realized that if I wanted my family to understand what had been happening, I would need to provide much more specific information about Tyler's behavior and its impact on my life. The conversation was no longer just about vacation expenses. It had become about confronting years of dysfunction that had been hidden beneath the surface of our supposedly close family relationships. "Dad, this isn't something that can be fixed with a payment plan. Tyler has been systematically lying about his employment status, his financial needs, and his intentions regarding repayment. Every request for money has been accompanied by elaborate stories about temporary setbacks and imminent job opportunities that never materialize. Tyler's composure began to crack as he realized that I was prepared to provide much more detail than he had anticipated. Jessica, you're being completely unfair. I've been going through a really tough time, and I thought my family would be supportive. I never expected you to keep track of every dollar like some kind of loan shark. The emotional manipulation in his response was transparent once I learned to recognize it. Tyler was attempting to reframe my legitimate concerns about his behavior as evidence of my own character flaws. According to his logic, the problem wasn't his failure to repay loans or his dishonesty about his circumstances. The problem was my unreasonable expectation that family members should honor their commitments to each other. My mother attempted to restore peace by suggesting that everyone was getting too emotional and that we should table the discussion until we could all approach it more calmly. But I had spent years accommodating other people's comfort at the expense of addressing real problems, and I was no longer willing to prioritize harmony over honesty. Mom, I don't think you understand the scope of what's been happening. Tyler isn't going through a rough patch that requires temporary family support. He has developed a sophisticated system for extracting money from me while maintaining the appearance of being actively job searching and working toward independence. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I had been tracking Tyler's requests and promises. In January of last year, Tyler asked for $800 to cover utilities that had been shut off due to non-payment. He promised to repay the money within 3 weeks when he received his first paycheck from a new job. 2 weeks later, he posted Instagram photos from a weekend ski trip to Flagstaff. Tyler's face flushed red as I continued reading from my documentation. In March, he needed $1,200 for car repairs that were supposedly preventing him from getting to job interviews. The same week I transferred the money, he purchased a new gaming console and posted about it on social media. The pattern was undeniable once laid out in chronological detail. Tyler's supposed financial emergencies consistently coincided with discretionary spending that would have been impossible if he had truly been struggling to cover basic living expenses. More importantly, his promises of repayment were always tied to job opportunities that either didn't exist or that he had no intention of pursuing seriously. My father's expression grew increasingly troubled as I provided more examples of Tyler's deceptive behavior. As someone who had worked steadily for over 30 years and took pride in meeting his financial obligations, he seemed genuinely disturbed by the evidence of Tyler's systematic dishonesty. Tyler, is this accurate? Have you been asking Jessica for money while spending on non-essential items? Tyler's response revealed just how trapped he had become by his own lies. He couldn't deny the factual accuracy of my documentation without being caught in an obvious falsehood, but admitting the truth would force him to acknowledge the manipulative nature of his behavior. It's not that simple, Dad. Sometimes I get money from other sources, like odd jobs or gifts, and I use that for different things. Jessica is making it sound like I'm deliberately deceiving people, but really I'm just trying to manage a complicated financial situation. The explanation was nonsensical when examined closely, but it demonstrated Tyler's skill at creating confusion that made it difficult to pin down exactly what he was admitting or denying. He was simultaneously acknowledging that he had other sources of income while maintaining that his requests for emergency assistance were legitimate. David, who had remained silent throughout most of the conversation, finally spoke up with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Tyler, if you have income from odd jobs and other sources, why haven't you been able to make any payments toward the money you've borrowed from Jessica? The question was devastating in its simplicity. Tyler had just claimed that he had access to money from various sources, which should have made it possible for him to begin repaying his loans, even if he couldn't cover the full amounts immediately. His failure to make any payments, despite having some income, suggested that repayment had never been a genuine priority. Tyler struggled to formulate a response that would address David's question without further undermining his credibility. Well, those other sources aren't consistent, and I have to prioritize basic living expenses. I always planned to start paying Jessica back once I got stable employment. The circular logic was obvious to everyone in the room. Tyler claimed he needed money for basic living expenses, but evidence suggested he was spending on entertainment and luxury items. He claimed he was actively seeking stable employment, but his behavior suggested that maintaining this fiction was more important than actually finding work that would enable financial independence. My mother, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation revealed the extent of Tyler's deception, made one final attempt to minimize the significance of what we were discussing. Jessica, I understand that you're frustrated, but Tyler is your brother. Family members help each other, and sometimes that help isn't repaid in the exact way we originally planned. Her statement encapsulated everything that was wrong with our family's approach to Tyler's behavior. Rather than holding him accountable for his dishonesty and manipulation, she was suggesting that I should simply accept financial exploitation as a normal part of family relationships. Mom, there's a difference between helping family members during genuine emergencies and enabling someone to avoid taking responsibility for their own life. Tyler isn't going through temporary difficulties. He's deliberately chosen to live off other people's money, rather than develop the skills and work ethic necessary for independence. The conversation had reached a point where continued discussions seemed unlikely to produce any resolution. Tyler was clearly unwilling to acknowledge the full extent of his deceptive behavior, and our parents appeared more concerned with maintaining family harmony than addressing the underlying problems that had created this situation. But I had one more revelation that would make it impossible for anyone to continue minimizing the seriousness of Tyler's behavior. The information had come from David's investigation into Tyler's supposed unemployment, and it would demonstrate conclusively that Tyler's financial requests had been based on deliberate lies rather than genuine need. There's something else you all need to know about Tyler's financial situation. David's friend Marcus works in human resources at Southwest Construction, and he told us something very interesting about Tyler's employment status. Tyler's face went completely white as he realized what I was about to reveal. He opened his mouth as if to object or interrupt, but no words came out. For the first time since I had known him, Tyler appeared to be genuinely speechless. Tyler has been working full-time at Southwest Construction for the past 8 months. He's been earning $18 an hour plus overtime, which means he's been bringing home approximately $2,800 per month. He asked them to pay him in cash because he claimed he was having issues with his bank account. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Everything Tyler had told us about his employment status, his financial struggles, and his desperate need for assistance had been a complete fabrication. While he was asking me for money to cover basic living expenses, he was actually earning a decent income that he had been hiding from the entire family. My mother's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while my father sat back in his chair as if he had been physically pushed. The implications of Tyler's deception went far beyond the money he had taken from me. He had been lying to everyone, manipulating their emotions, and exploiting their love and concern for his own benefit. Tyler finally found his voice, but his response only made the situation worse. That's not exactly accurate. I've been doing some work for them, but it's not a regular full-time position. It's more like project-based contract work. The distinction he was trying to make was meaningless in the context of what we had just learned. Even if his employment had been irregular, the fact remained that he had been earning substantial income while claiming to be unemployed and unable to repay his loans. David provided additional details that made Tyler's deception even more damning. Marcus said Tyler has been one of their most reliable workers. He shows up every day, works overtime when it's available, and has been offered a permanent position with benefits. The only reason he's being paid in cash is because he specifically requested that arrangement. The cash payment request revealed the calculating nature of Tyler's deception. By insisting on cash payments, Tyler had ensured that his income wouldn't be easily traced or documented. This allowed him to maintain the fiction of unemployment while actually earning more money than many people in steady jobs. My father, who prided himself on being able to read people and situations accurately, seemed particularly shaken by the revelation that Tyler had been able to deceive him so completely. Tyler, help me understand this. If you've been working and earning money, why have you been asking Jessica for financial assistance? The question forced Tyler to confront the central contradiction in his behavior. He couldn't claim that his requests for money had been motivated by genuine need when he had been earning a substantial income the entire time. Any explanation he offered would require admitting that he had been deliberately exploiting his family's generosity. Tyler's final attempt at justification revealed just how deep his sense of entitlement had become. Look, the money I earn from construction work is unpredictable, and I have a lot of expenses that you guys don't know about. Sometimes I need extra cash to cover things, and I figured Jessica was doing well enough that she could help out her brother. The response was breathtaking in its audacity. Tyler was essentially admitting that he had been taking money from me not because he needed it for survival, but because he wanted additional spending money beyond what his job provided. He had been treating me like a personal ATM that he could access whenever he wanted to fund a lifestyle that exceeded his actual income. More importantly, his response revealed that he had never had any intention of repaying the money he had borrowed. The loans had always been gifts in Tyler's mind. He had simply used the language of borrowing to make his requests seem more reasonable and temporary. The vacation demand that had started this conversation now took on an entirely different significance. Tyler wasn't asking our parents to cover his vacation expenses because he couldn't afford to pay his own way. He was asking them to subsidize his leisure activities while simultaneously expecting me to pay for my own participation in the same trip. The systematic nature of Tyler's manipulation was finally clear to everyone in the room. He had developed a comprehensive strategy for extracting money from family members while maintaining the appearance of being a victim of circumstances beyond his control. The strategy had worked for years because none of us had been sharing information about his requests or comparing notes about his various explanations and promises. As the full scope of Tyler's deception became apparent, I felt a mixture of anger and relief. The anger was obvious. I had been systematically exploited by someone I loved and trusted, but the relief was equally significant. For the first time in years, I could see clearly what had been happening and why I had felt increasingly uncomfortable with the family's financial dynamics. The conversation had fundamentally changed our family relationships in ways that couldn't be reversed or forgotten. Tyler's carefully constructed facade had been completely demolished, and there was no going back to the previous dynamic where his behavior was excused or overlooked. My parents now had to confront their own role in enabling Tyler's manipulation. Their willingness to make excuses for his behavior and provide financial support without accountability had created the conditions that made his exploitation of me possible. Most importantly, I finally understood that protecting Tyler from the consequences of his choices hadn't helped him develop into a responsible adult. Instead, it had enabled him to become increasingly skilled at manipulation and increasingly dependent on other people's resources. The silence that had begun this phase of the conversation returned, but it felt different now. Instead of the shock and confusion that had followed my initial revelation, this silence felt like a reckoning. Everyone in the room was processing not just what they had learned about Tyler, but what they had learned about themselves and our family dynamics. David squeezed my hand again, and I realized that we had reached a turning point that would require decisive action. The conversation had revealed the problems, but simply understanding what had been wrong wouldn't be sufficient to create meaningful change. Tyler was still sitting at the table, but his entire demeanor had changed. The confident manipulation and emotional appeals had been replaced by something that looked almost like genuine shame. For the first time since I had known him, Tyler appeared to understand that his behavior had real consequences, and that he couldn't simply talk his way out of accountability. The question now was what would happen next. The vacation that had precipitated this conversation was still on the table, but everything about the family dynamics that had shaped the original proposal had been fundamentally altered. I knew that whatever happened next would determine not just whether I went to Cabo, but what kind of relationship I would have with my family going forward. The revelation about Tyler's hidden employment had created a new dynamic at our family dinner table, but I quickly realized that exposure of his deception was only the beginning of what needed to happen. My parents sat in stunned silence, processing the information that their 32-year-old son had been systematically lying to them while manipulating me into providing thousands of dollars in unnecessary financial support. Tyler seemed to understand that his usual tactics would no longer work in this new reality. The emotional appeals and victim narratives that had been so effective in the past were now obviously inadequate, given what everyone had learned about his actual circumstances. But rather than acknowledging the harm he had caused or expressing genuine remorse, Tyler appeared to be calculating his next move. My mother was the first to attempt damage control, though her approach revealed how deeply ingrained the family's dysfunction had become. Tyler, I'm very disappointed in you for not being honest with us about your job. But, Jessica, maybe this means he'll be able to start paying you back now that we know he has income. Her response demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what had been happening and what needed to change. She was treating Tyler's deception as a simple matter of poor communication, rather than recognizing it as evidence of calculated manipulation. More problematically, she was still operating under the assumption that the primary issue was the money itself, rather than the betrayal of trust and exploitation of family relationships. I realized that if I wanted to create real change in these dynamics, I would need to be much more direct about what I expected going forward. The conversation had exposed the problems, but exposure alone wouldn't prevent Tyler from simply developing new strategies for exploitation, or our parents from continuing to enable his behavior through misplaced compassion. Mom, this isn't just about Tyler getting a job and starting to pay me back. This is about the fact that he has been deliberately deceiving all of us for months, while taking advantage of my willingness to help family members in need. The money is important, but the bigger issue is that Tyler has been treating our family relationships as opportunities for manipulation rather than sources of genuine support. My father, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since learning about Tyler's employment, finally spoke up with a question that suggested he was beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation. Tyler, how long were you planning to continue asking for money while you were actually working? Were you ever going to tell us about your job? The question struck at the heart of Tyler's deception. His lies hadn't been spontaneous responses to unexpected circumstances. They had been part of a deliberate strategy that required ongoing maintenance and elaboration. Every family gathering where he complained about his inability to find work had been a performance designed to maintain his access to financial support. Tyler's response revealed both his desperation and his continued unwillingness to take full responsibility for his actions. I was planning to tell everyone about the job once it became more permanent. I didn't want to get everyone's hopes up if it didn't work out. And the money I was making wasn't always enough to cover all my expenses, so I still needed help sometimes. The explanation was carefully constructed to make his deception seem reasonable, while avoiding admission of deliberate manipulation. According to Tyler's logic, he had been protecting the family from disappointment, rather than exploiting their generosity. The continued requests for money were framed as genuine needs rather than exploitation of artificially maintained financial dependence. But David's analytical mind cut through Tyler's attempted justification with devastating clarity. Tyler, if you were earning $2,800 a month and still couldn't cover your basic expenses, that suggests either extremely poor financial management or spending on non-essential items. Given that Jessica has documented your purchases of entertainment and luxury goods during the times you were claiming financial hardship, which explanation seems more accurate? The question forced Tyler to confront the mathematical impossibility of his claims. Someone earning nearly $3,000 per month should be able to cover basic living expenses in Phoenix, especially since Tyler was living in a modest apartment and didn't have dependents or unusual financial obligations. Tyler's attempts to justify his spending patterns only made his situation worse. You guys don't understand all the expenses that come with construction work. I have to buy tools and equipment, and sometimes I need to travel to different job sites. Plus, I have student loans and other debts that you don't know about. Each explanation he offered created new questions about his honesty and financial management. If Tyler had significant debts that were creating genuine financial hardship, why hadn't he mentioned them when asking for money? If work-related expenses were eating into his income, why hadn't he budgeted for these predictable costs? Most importantly, why had he chosen to fund entertainment and luxury purchases rather than addressing his supposed debt obligations? My mother made another attempt to minimize the conflict by suggesting that we focus on moving forward rather than analyzing past mistakes. I think the important thing is that Tyler has learned from this experience and that we can all work together to improve the situation going forward. Her desire to avoid confrontation was understandable, but it represented exactly the kind of thinking that had enabled Tyler's behavior to continue for so long. By treating his systematic deception as a learning experience rather than a serious betrayal of trust, she was already creating the conditions for similar problems to arise in the future. I had spent years accommodating my family's discomfort with conflict, but I finally understood that avoiding difficult conversations had allowed serious problems to fester and grow worse over time. If I wanted to have healthy relationships with my family members, I would need to insist on honesty and accountability, even when those standards created temporary discomfort. Mom, Tyler hasn't learned from this experience, because he's still trying to justify his behavior rather than acknowledging that it was wrong. Until he can honestly admit that he deliberately deceived us for his own financial benefit, there's no reason to believe that similar problems won't happen again. The directness of my response seemed to surprise my mother, who was accustomed to my more diplomatic approach to family conflicts. But I had reached a point where diplomacy felt like complicity in maintaining dysfunctional patterns that were harmful to everyone involved. Tyler realized that his usual strategies weren't working and attempted a different approach that combined partial admission with emotional manipulation. Look, I know I made some mistakes, and I should have been more honest about my situation. I was embarrassed about the kind of work I was doing, and I didn't want everyone to know that I was doing manual labor after all the education and opportunities I've had. The new explanation was more sophisticated than his previous attempts because it contained elements of psychological truth, while still avoiding full accountability. Tyler was acknowledging some wrongdoing while framing it as the result of shame and insecurity, rather than deliberate manipulation. But I had learned to recognize the patterns in Tyler's responses, and I could see that he was still attempting to control the narrative, rather than genuinely taking responsibility for his actions. His embarrassment about construction work didn't explain why he had lied about being unemployed, rather than simply being honest about his job. More importantly, it didn't explain why he had continued taking money from me while earning an income that made such assistance unnecessary. Tyler, even if you were embarrassed about your job, that doesn't explain why you continued asking me for money for basic living expenses while you were earning enough to cover those expenses yourself. Embarrassment might explain lying about your employment status, but it doesn't explain exploiting my willingness to help family members in need. My response forced Tyler to confront the distinction between understanding his motivations and excusing his behavior. Even if his feelings about his job had contributed to his initial deception, the systematic nature of his financial exploitation couldn't be explained away by embarrassment or insecurity. David provided additional perspective that highlighted the broader implications of Tyler's behavior. Jessica, I think it's important to recognize that this pattern of deception required a lot of planning and maintenance. Tyler had to remember which stories he had told to which people, coordinate his requests with his actual income, and consistently present himself as someone who was actively job searching. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to embarrassment. It was a deliberate strategy. The observation was crucial because it demonstrated that Tyler's behavior hadn't been the result of momentary lapses in judgment or emotional reactions to difficult circumstances. Instead, it represented a calculated approach to exploiting family relationships for financial gain. My father, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of Tyler's deception became clear, finally expressed the anger that had been building throughout the conversation. Tyler, I'm having trouble understanding how you could look your sister in the eye and ask for money to pay rent while you were earning nearly $3,000 a month. That's not embarrassment or poor judgment, that's deliberate dishonesty. The disappointment in my father's voice was profound. As someone who had worked honestly for his entire career and took pride in meeting his obligations, he seemed personally offended by Tyler's willingness to exploit family trust for financial gain. Tyler's response to our father's criticism revealed how desperate he had become to avoid taking full responsibility for his actions. Dad, you're making it sound like I was stealing from Jessica, but these were loans that I always intended to pay back. I just needed time to get my finances organized. The claim that he had always intended to repay the loans was particularly galling given what we now knew about his income and spending patterns. If Tyler had been earning substantial money for months while continuing to borrow from me, his failure to make any payments couldn't be explained by lack of resources or inability to organize his finances. I decided that the conversation had reached a point where Tyler's continued attempts at justification were actively harmful to any possibility of genuine resolution. Rather than continuing to debate the details of his deception, I needed to focus on establishing clear boundaries and expectations for future interactions. Tyler, I don't care what your intentions were, or what your explanations are for what you did. What I care about is that you systematically lied to me and exploited my trust for your own financial benefit. That behavior needs to stop completely, and there need to be concrete steps to repair the damage you've caused. The shift from analysis to action seemed to catch Tyler off guard. He had been focused on managing everyone's perception of his behavior, but now he was being confronted with demands for specific changes and accountability measures. My mother attempted one more intervention to soften the confrontation and restore family harmony. Jessica, I think Tyler understands that he made mistakes. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement where he pays you back gradually while we all work on improving our communication. Her suggestion revealed the persistence of the enabling patterns that had made Tyler's exploitation possible in the first place. Rather than insisting on accountability and consequences, she was proposing a gentle approach that would allow Tyler to gradually work his way back into everyone's good graces, without facing significant consequences for his behavior. But I had learned that protecting Tyler from consequences hadn't helped him develop into a responsible adult. It had simply enabled him to become more sophisticated in his manipulation techniques. If I wanted to have a healthy relationship with my brother, I would need to insist on standards that required genuine change rather than cosmetic improvements. Mom, Tyler doesn't just need to pay me back the money he borrowed. He needs to acknowledge the full extent of what he did and demonstrate that he understands why it was harmful. Until that happens, I'm not comfortable continuing to have the same kind of relationship with him that we've had in the past. The statement represented a fundamental shift in my approach to family relationships. Instead of prioritizing harmony and avoiding conflict, I was insisting on honesty and accountability as prerequisites for continued closeness. Tyler seemed to realize that his situation had become much more serious than he had initially understood. The revelation of his deception hadn't just created temporary embarrassment. It had fundamentally altered his relationships with family members who had previously been sources of support and assistance. But rather than accepting responsibility and working toward genuine change, Tyler made one final attempt to regain control of the situation through emotional manipulation. Jessica, I can't believe you're willing to destroy our family over money. I thought family was supposed to forgive each other and work through problems together. The response was a masterful example of Tyler's manipulative skills. He was attempting to reframe the situation so that I became the villain for insisting on accountability, while he became the victim of my unreasonable demands. According to his logic, my expectations of honesty and repayment were evidence of my failure to understand the true meaning of family relationships. But I had learned to recognize this particular manipulation tactic, and I was no longer willing to accept responsibility for problems that Tyler had created through his own choices. Tyler, I'm not destroying our family. I'm insisting on the kind of honesty and respect that healthy families are built on. If you see those standards as destructive, that tells me a lot about how you view family relationships. The conversation had reached a natural conclusion. Tyler's deception had been exposed, his attempts at justification had been unsuccessful, and the family dynamics that had enabled his behavior were now visible to everyone involved. What remained was the question of what would happen next, and whether meaningful change was possible. I realized that the Cabo vacation that had started this conversation was now the least important issue we were facing. The financial arrangements for the trip had been based on assumptions about Tyler's circumstances that were now known to be false. More importantly, the family relationships that would determine who went on the trip and under what conditions had been fundamentally altered by what had been revealed. David squeezed my hand and leaned over to whisper that he was proud of how I had handled the situation. His support meant everything to me, especially since I knew that taking a firm stand with my family might create lasting changes in those relationships. My parents sat in uncomfortable silence, apparently unsure how to process what they had learned, or how to move forward with family relationships that had been built on false assumptions. Tyler stared at his phone, perhaps hoping that the conversation would simply end without any concrete consequences or commitments. But I knew that this conversation was just the beginning of a much larger process of establishing new boundaries and expectations. The revelation of Tyler's deception had created an opportunity for genuine change, but only if everyone involved was willing to do the difficult work of building healthier patterns of interaction. The question of the Cabo vacation would need to be addressed, but it was now part of a much larger conversation about honesty, accountability, and what it meant to be a supportive family member. The easy solutions and comfortable compromises were no longer available. We would all need to decide what kind of relationships we wanted to have going forward. The weight of the revelations hung heavy in the dining room, as my family struggled to process everything that had been exposed about Tyler's systematic deception. The comfortable illusions that had governed our family dynamics for years had been shattered, and none of us seemed quite sure how to navigate this new reality, where Tyler's victim narrative had been revealed as an elaborate manipulation. I could see my parents wrestling with their own complicity in enabling Tyler's behavior. For years, they had made excuses for his failures and provided financial support without requiring accountability. They had praised me for being responsible and independent, while simultaneously expecting me to subsidize Tyler's lifestyle through the loans they hadn't even known about. Tyler himself appeared to be cycling through different emotional states as he realized that his usual strategies were no longer effective. The confident manipulation had given way to desperate justification, which was now transitioning into what looked like genuine panic, as he understood that this conversation would have lasting consequences for his relationships and his access to family resources. David remained a steady presence beside me, offering silent support while allowing me to navigate this family crisis in my own way. His earlier questions had been instrumental in exposing the contradictions in Tyler's explanations, but he was careful not to overstep his role as my partner rather than a family member. The silence stretched on until my father finally spoke with a heaviness in his voice that I had rarely heard before. "Tyler, I need you to help me understand something. When you were asking Jessica for money to cover basic expenses, what were you spending your actual income on?" The question cut straight to the heart of Tyler's financial deception. If he had been earning $2,800 a month while claiming he couldn't afford rent and utilities, where had that money been going? The answer would reveal whether Tyler's requests had been motivated by genuine financial mismanagement or by something more calculating. Tyler's hesitation before responding told us everything we needed to know. He had been hoping to avoid this level of detailed scrutiny, but my father's direct question made it impossible to continue deflecting with vague explanations about work expenses and unexpected costs. I had a lot of different expenses that you guys wouldn't necessarily know about. Construction work requires special boots and tools, and sometimes I had to drive to job sites that were pretty far away. Plus, I was trying to save up some money for the future and maybe get a place with better amenities. The explanation was revealing in ways Tyler probably hadn't intended. Rather than claiming that his income had been insufficient to cover basic needs, he was now admitting that he had been making discretionary choices about how to spend his money. The tools and transportation costs he mentioned were legitimate work expenses, but they wouldn't account for the majority of his income. More tellingly, Tyler had admitted that he was saving money and considering upgrading his living situation. These were the financial priorities of someone who had disposable income beyond their basic needs, not someone who required emergency assistance from family members to avoid eviction or utility shutoffs. My mother appeared to be having her own revelation as she processed Tyler's admission. "Tyler, if you were saving money and looking at better apartments, why were you telling Jessica that you needed help with rent and utilities?" The question demonstrated that even my mother, who had always been Tyler's most sympathetic advocate, was beginning to understand the calculated nature of his deception. Tyler hadn't been borrowing money because he couldn't afford basic expenses. He had been borrowing money because it allowed him to maintain a higher standard of living than his income would have supported. Tyler's response showed that he was finally beginning to understand that his explanations were only making his situation worse. "Look, maybe I could have managed my money better, but it's not like I was living some kind of luxury lifestyle. I was just trying to get by and maybe improve my situation a little bit." The defensive tone revealed Tyler's growing desperation, but his words also contained an implicit admission that his financial requests hadn't been motivated by genuine necessity. He was acknowledging that he could have managed his expenses differently, which meant that his claims of financial emergency had been deliberately misleading. I realized that this was the moment to establish clear expectations for how Tyler would address the harm he had caused. The conversation had exposed his deception, but exposure alone wouldn't repair the damage or prevent similar problems in the future. If I wanted to maintain any kind of relationship with my brother, I needed to see concrete evidence that he understood the seriousness of his actions and was committed to making genuine changes. "Tyler, here's what needs to happen if you want to repair our relationship. First, you need to acknowledge specifically what you did wrong without making excuses or trying to minimize the impact. Second, you need to create a realistic plan for repaying the $38,000 you borrowed under false pretenses. Third, you need to demonstrate that you understand why this behavior was harmful to our entire family, not just to me. The specificity of my demands seemed to catch Tyler off guard. He had been accustomed to vague conversations about improving communication or being more considerate in the future. Instead, I was requiring concrete acknowledgments and commitments that would be difficult to fulfill without genuine change in his attitude and behavior. My father nodded approvingly at my approach, suggesting that he understood the importance of clear expectations and accountability. Jessica is right, Tyler. This isn't something that can be fixed with apologies and good intentions. You need to take specific steps to address what you've done. Tyler looked around the table as if hoping someone would intervene on his behalf or suggest a less demanding resolution to the conflict. But for the first time in memory, there was no one rushing to make excuses for his behavior or to cushion him from the natural consequences of his choices. My mother still appeared uncomfortable with the level of confrontation taking place, but even she seemed to recognize that Tyler's behavior had crossed lines that couldn't be overlooked or minimized. Tyler, honey, I think you need to really think about what Jessica is asking and whether you're ready to make these kinds of commitments. Her use of the word commitments was significant because it suggested that she finally understood Tyler would need to follow through on specific actions rather than simply expressing regret or promising to do better in the future. Tyler's response revealed both his desperation and his continued resistance to taking full responsibility for his actions. Jessica, I hear what you're saying, and I know I messed up. But $38,000 is a lot of money, and with my current income, it would take me years to pay that back. Maybe we could work out something more reasonable, like $5,000 or $10,000, and call it even. The audacity of Tyler's counteroffer was breathtaking. He was suggesting that I should forgive the majority of the money he had taken under false pretenses, as if the amount of his deception was negotiable, based on his convenience or comfort level. David's sharp intake of breath beside me suggested that he was as stunned as I was by Tyler's attempt to negotiate down his debt. The proposal revealed that Tyler still didn't understand the fundamental nature of what he had done wrong. He was treating the situation like a business dispute that could be resolved through compromise, rather than recognizing it as a betrayal of trust that required genuine accountability. Tyler, you're missing the point entirely. This isn't a negotiation about how much money you can afford to pay back. This is about acknowledging that you deliberately deceived me and took advantage of my trust. The full amount of money needs to be repaid, because that's what you actually borrowed, not some reduced amount that feels more convenient for you. My response was harsher than I had intended, but Tyler's attempt to bargain down his debt had triggered a level of anger that I hadn't fully recognized until that moment. The suggestion that I should simply absorb the majority of his fraud as a family favor demonstrated that he still saw me as a resource to be managed, rather than a person who deserved honesty and respect. Tyler's face flushed with what looked like genuine anger for the first time during the conversation. Jessica, you're being completely unrealistic. I never asked you to give me $38,000 all at once. These were small amounts over a long period of time, and I always said I would pay you back when I could. His response revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how trust and honesty work in relationships. Tyler seemed to believe that the gradual nature of his deception somehow made it less serious, or that his promises of eventual repayment absolved him of responsibility for the lies he had told to obtain the money. My father's intervention demonstrated that he finally understood the severity of Tyler's behavior and wasn't willing to allow him to continue minimizing his actions. Tyler, it doesn't matter whether you took the money all at once or a little bit at a time. What matters is that you lied about your circumstances to get money you didn't actually need. That's fraud, son, and the fact that Jessica is your sister doesn't make it acceptable. The word fraud hung in the air like a physical presence. None of us had used that term before, but my father's blunt assessment captured the legal and moral reality of Tyler's behavior in a way that was impossible to dismiss or reframe. Tyler seemed genuinely shocked to hear his actions described in such stark terms. Dad, that's a really harsh way to put it. I never intended to defraud anyone. I was just going through a tough time and needed help. But his protests were no longer convincing to anyone at the table. The evidence of his deliberate deception was too overwhelming, and his continued attempts to justify his behavior only reinforced the impression that he lacked genuine remorse or understanding of the harm he had caused. I decided that the conversation had reached a point where continued discussion would be counterproductive, unless Tyler was willing to make concrete commitments about changing his behavior. Tyler, I'm going to give you some time to think about what I've asked for. But I want you to understand that until you're ready to acknowledge what you did and commit to making it right, I'm not going to pretend that everything is normal between us. The statement represented a significant departure from my usual approach to family conflicts. Instead of working to maintain harmony at any cost, I was establishing clear boundaries that would govern our future interactions based on Tyler's willingness to take responsibility for his actions. My mother looked distressed at the prospect of ongoing family tension, but she seemed to understand that the situation couldn't be resolved through her usual strategies of encouraging everyone to forgive and forget. Jessica, what does that mean exactly? Are you saying you won't see Tyler until he pays you back? Her question revealed the practical implications of the boundary I had established. Family gatherings, holidays, and other interactions would all be affected if Tyler and I couldn't find a way to resolve this conflict in a manner that addressed the underlying problems, rather than simply papering over them. Mom, I'm saying that I need to see genuine accountability and commitment to change before I can feel comfortable having the same kind of relationship with Tyler that we've had in the past. That doesn't necessarily mean cutting off all contact, but it does mean that I won't participate in family activities where Tyler's behavior is treated as if it's not a serious problem. The boundary I was establishing felt both necessary and frightening. I had never taken such a firm stand with my family before, and I wasn't sure how they would respond to my refusal to prioritize family harmony over personal integrity. David's supportive squeeze of my hand reminded me that I wasn't alone in this decision. Whatever happened with my family relationships, I had a partner who understood why these boundaries were important, and who would support me in maintaining them. Tyler's final attempt at emotional manipulation revealed the depths of his entitlement and his resistance to accepting responsibility for his actions. Jessica, I can't believe you're choosing money over family. Mom, Dad, are you really going to let her destroy our family over this? The appeal to our parents was a classic manipulation tactic, designed to pressure me into backing down by making me responsible for family conflict. Tyler was attempting to reframe the situation so that my insistence on accountability became the problem rather than his systematic deception and exploitation. But my father's response showed that Tyler's manipulation was no longer effective. Tyler, Jessica isn't destroying our family. Your dishonesty is what created this problem, and your refusal to take responsibility for it is what's preventing it from being resolved. The firmness in my father's voice surprised everyone at the table. Throughout our childhood, he had been the mediator who encouraged compromise and understanding. But the evidence of Tyler's calculated deception had apparently crossed a line that made mediation inappropriate. My mother nodded reluctantly in agreement with my father's assessment. Tyler, I love you, but what you did was wrong, and Jessica has every right to expect you to make it right. The united front from our parents represented a dramatic shift in family dynamics. For the first time in memory, Tyler was facing accountability without anyone rushing to his defense or making excuses for his behavior. Tyler seemed to realize that his usual strategies had not only failed, but had actually made his situation worse. The emotional appeals and victim narratives that had been so effective in the past were now transparent manipulation attempts that only reinforced everyone's understanding of his problematic behavior patterns. The conversation had reached a natural ending point, but the question of the Cabo vacation remained unresolved. The original proposal had been based on assumptions about Tyler's financial circumstances that were now known to be false. More importantly, the family dynamics that had shaped the vacation arrangements had been fundamentally altered by what had been revealed. I realized that the vacation could actually serve as a test case for whether meaningful change was possible in our family relationships. The way we handled the financial arrangements and expectations for the trip would demonstrate whether Tyler was willing to take responsibility for his circumstances, and whether our parents were ready to stop enabling his irresponsible behavior. So let's talk about this vacation, I said, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the table. Tyler, given what we now know about your income and employment status, what do you think would be appropriate regarding the financial arrangements? The question was designed to give Tyler an opportunity to demonstrate accountability by voluntarily offering to pay his own way for the trip. It would be a relatively small gesture compared to repaying the $38,000 he owed me, but it would signal a willingness to start taking responsibility for his own expenses. Tyler's response revealed that he still hadn't internalized the lessons of our conversation. Well, Mom and Dad already made the arrangements based on me not being able to contribute. It would be kind of complicated to change everything now. His answer demonstrated that Tyler was still looking for ways to avoid taking responsibility for his circumstances. Rather than offering to pay his own way now that his deception had been exposed, he was hiding behind the practical difficulties of changing existing arrangements. My mother's intervention showed that she was beginning to understand the importance of requiring Tyler to face the consequences of his choices. Tyler, I think we can figure out how to adjust the arrangements. The question is whether you're willing to pay for your own vacation, now that we know you have the income to do so. Her direct challenge surprised Tyler, who had clearly expected our parents to continue protecting him from uncomfortable expectations. The shift in their approach represented a significant change that would affect much more than just vacation planning. Tyler's reluctant agreement to pay his own vacation expenses felt like a small victory, but I realized that it was just the beginning of a much longer process of establishing new family dynamics. Okay, fine. I can pay for my own part of the trip, but I still think Jessica is being unreasonable about the loan repayment. His continued resistance to taking full responsibility for the money he owed demonstrated that Tyler hadn't yet made the fundamental shift in thinking that would be necessary for genuine change. He was willing to make small concessions to avoid immediate conflict, but he wasn't ready to acknowledge the full scope of accountability that would be required to repair our relationship. The conversation was drawing to a close, but I knew that this was really just the beginning of a longer reckoning with family patterns that had been developing for years. Tyler's deception had been exposed, but changing the dynamics that had made such deception possible would require ongoing effort from everyone involved. David and I gathered our things and prepared to leave, but I paused at the door to address my family one more time. I want you all to know that I love you, and I want to have healthy relationships with everyone. But healthy relationships require honesty and mutual respect, and I'm not willing to settle for less than that anymore. The drive home was mostly quiet, as David and I processed everything that had happened. The conversation had been more intense and revelatory than either of us had expected, and we both needed time to absorb the implications of what had been revealed. How do you feel about how it went? David asked as we pulled into our apartment complex. Exhausted, but relieved, I replied honestly. I think it was the first time I've ever been completely honest with my family about something important, and that feels both scary and liberating. David nodded in understanding. I'm proud of you for standing your ground. I know that wasn't easy, especially with Tyler trying to manipulate everyone's emotions. As we walked up to our apartment, I reflected on how much had changed in the course of a single conversation. The family dynamics that had seemed normal and unchangeable just hours earlier had been revealed as dysfunctional patterns that had been harming everyone involved. The question now was whether the rest of my family would be willing to do the difficult work of building healthier relationships based on honesty and accountability, or whether they would try to return to the comfortable dysfunction that had characterized our interactions for so many years. I knew that my own willingness to maintain boundaries would be tested repeatedly in the coming months. Tyler would likely continue trying to find ways around the accountability I had demanded, and my parents would probably feel tempted to return to their enabling patterns when faced with Tyler's distress or manipulation. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt confident in my ability to recognize manipulation and to insist on the kind of respect that healthy relationships required. The conversation had been painful, but it had also been empowering in ways that I was only beginning to understand. The Cabo vacation was still weeks away, and I suspected that the intervening time would reveal a lot about whether my family was truly ready to change, or whether they would simply wait for the immediate crisis to blow over before returning to their old patterns. Whatever happened, I knew that I had fundamentally altered my role in the family system by refusing to continue subsidizing Tyler's irresponsibility, and by insisting on honesty as a prerequisite for closeness. The changes wouldn't be easy for anyone, but they felt necessary for the long-term health of our relationships. As I settled into bed that night, I felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation about what the future would hold for my family relationships. The conversation had opened up possibilities for genuine change, but it had also created uncertainty about whether such change was actually possible given the deeply ingrained patterns we were trying to overcome. One thing was certain. The comfortable illusions that had governed our family dynamics were gone forever, and whatever relationships emerged from this crisis would need to be built on a foundation of truth and mutual respect, rather than enabling and manipulation. The weeks following that explosive family dinner passed in an uncomfortable limbo that none of us had experienced before. Tyler had agreed to pay his own way for the Cabo vacation, but his resentment about the new expectations was palpable during our subsequent family interactions. He attended the usual Sunday dinners with a sullen demeanor that made everyone else feel like they were walking on eggshells. My parents seemed torn between their newfound understanding of Tyler's manipulative behavior and their natural inclination to restore family harmony by encouraging me to be more forgiving. They would make subtle comments about how Tyler seemed to be trying harder, or how important it was for family members to support each other through difficult transitions. I found myself constantly vigilant against the familiar patterns of guilt and manipulation that had governed our family dynamics for so long. Every conversation felt like a test of my resolve to maintain the boundaries I had established, and I was surprised by how exhausting it was to resist the pressure to return to my old role as Tyler's unofficial financial safety net. David was an invaluable source of support during this period, helping me recognize when I was being manipulated and encouraging me to trust my instincts about what constituted appropriate behavior from family members. His outside perspective made it easier for me to see the dynamics clearly rather than getting caught up in the emotional manipulation that felt so natural within my family system. 3 weeks before our departure date, Tyler made his first direct attempt to test the boundaries I had established. He called me on a Thursday evening, ostensibly to discuss logistics for the trip, but the conversation quickly shifted to a request for money that was presented as a temporary loan to help him cover the vacation expenses he had agreed to pay. "Jessica, I know things have been weird between us since that dinner, but I'm trying to do what you asked and pay my own way for Cabo. The problem is that the timing is really tight, and I won't get my next paycheck until after we're supposed to make the final payment to the resort. Could you spot me the money and I'll pay you back as soon as we get home?" The request was masterfully crafted to seem reasonable, while actually representing a continuation of exactly the behavior that had caused our conflict. Tyler was framing his request as compliance with my expectations, rather than acknowledging that asking me for more money was precisely what I had said needed to stop. "Tyler, the entire point of our conversation was that you need to take responsibility for your own expenses without relying on me to subsidize them. If you can't afford to pay for the vacation when the payment is due, then you need to make different arrangements, not ask me to cover the cost." My response was firmer than I had expected, but Tyler's attempt to manipulate me had triggered a clarity about our relationship that felt both surprising and empowering. I could see exactly what he was doing, and I was no longer willing to participate in the charade that his financial requests were legitimate emergencies. Tyler's reaction revealed how unaccustomed he was to being refused without lengthy explanations or negotiations. "Jessica, I'm not asking you to give me the money. I'm asking for a short-term loan that I'll definitely pay back. I thought you wanted me to be responsible, and paying for my own vacation is responsible." The circular logic of his argument was stunning in its audacity. Tyler was claiming that borrowing money from me was actually a demonstration of responsibility, because it would allow him to fulfill his commitment to pay his own way. He was reframing financial dependence as independence, and asking me to congratulate him for finding a way to avoid actually meeting the expectations that had been established. "Tyler, being responsible means managing your finances so that you can meet your commitments without borrowing money from family members. If you can't afford the vacation, then you shouldn't go. It's that simple." The conversation ended with Tyler expressing hurt and confusion about my unwillingness to help him, but I felt a sense of clarity and strength that I had never experienced before in our relationship. For the first time, I had refused one of Tyler's requests without feeling guilty, or wondering whether I was being unreasonable. When I told David about the conversation, he pointed out something that I hadn't fully recognized. "Jessica, Tyler just proved that he hasn't learned anything from what happened at your parents' house. He's still trying to find ways to get money from you, and he's still using manipulation to make it seem like you're the problem if you refuse. The observation helped me understand that Tyler's grudging agreement to pay his own vacation expenses hadn't represented genuine change in his thinking or behavior. Instead, it had been a strategic concession, designed to minimize immediate conflict while preserving his access to future financial support. 2 days later, my mother called with her own version of Tyler's request. She explained that Tyler had come to her in distress about his inability to afford the vacation payment, and she was wondering whether there might be some way to help him without creating more family conflict. Jessica, I know you're trying to teach Tyler to be more responsible, and I think that's important. But this vacation was supposed to be a chance for our family to spend quality time together, and it would be really sad if Tyler couldn't come because of a temporary cash flow problem. My mother's framing of the situation demonstrated how quickly the family was slipping back into the enabling patterns that had made Tyler's manipulation possible. She was treating his inability to afford the vacation as a temporary logistics problem rather than as evidence that he wasn't actually ready to take responsibility for his own expenses. Mom, Tyler's cash flow problem isn't temporary. He's been earning good money for months. And if he doesn't have enough saved to pay for a vacation, that's because he's been spending his income on other things instead of planning ahead. Helping him avoid the consequences of poor financial planning won't teach him to make better choices. My response felt harsh even to me, but I realized that protecting Tyler from the natural consequences of his choices had been exactly what prevented him from developing the skills and habits necessary for genuine independence. My mother's disappointment was evident in her voice, but she seemed to understand that pressuring me to change my position would be counterproductive. I just hate to see our family fractured over money, Jessica. These relationships are more important than any amount of financial disagreement. The comment revealed my mother's fundamental misunderstanding of what was at stake in our conflict. She was still framing the situation as a disagreement about money, rather than recognizing it as a question of whether our family relationships would be based on honesty and mutual respect, or on manipulation and exploitation. Mom, our family isn't fractured because of money. It's fractured because Tyler has been lying and manipulating for years, and some of us are finally refusing to pretend that's acceptable. The money is just how the problem manifested itself. The conversation with my mother left me feeling drained and frustrated, but it also reinforced my understanding of how deeply entrenched the dysfunctional patterns had become. Even after Tyler's deception had been exposed and acknowledged, the family was already moving toward accommodating his behavior rather than requiring him to change. David suggested that we consider taking our own vacation during the same time period, rather than participating in a family trip that was becoming increasingly complicated by Tyler's continued manipulation and our parents' enabling responses. Jessica, I'm not sure this family vacation is going to be the positive experience your parents are hoping for. There's so much tension and unresolved conflict that it might be better for everyone if we just took some time away and let your family work through their issues without us being in the middle of it. The suggestion was appealing because it would allow me to avoid the stress of managing family dynamics while trying to enjoy a vacation. But I also realized that removing myself from the situation might allow everyone else to slip back into the comfortable patterns that had enabled Tyler's behavior for so long. After much consideration, I decided that I needed to follow through on my commitment to the vacation while maintaining the boundaries I had established. If Tyler couldn't afford to pay his own way, then he wouldn't be able to come, and the family would need to adjust their expectations accordingly. 1 week before our departure date, the situation reached a crisis point when Tyler announced that he wouldn't be able to join the family vacation because he couldn't afford the required payment. Rather than acknowledging that his poor financial planning had created this problem, Tyler presented his absence as a sacrifice he was making to avoid creating more family conflict. My parents were devastated by Tyler's announcement and made one final appeal for me to reconsider my position. They argued that the vacation would be ruined without Tyler's presence, and that my insistence on strict financial accountability was preventing the family from enjoying what was supposed to be a celebration of their retirement and hard work. The emotional pressure was intense, and I found myself wavering between my commitment to maintaining boundaries and my desire to preserve family harmony. Tyler's manipulation had evolved to include making my parents feel guilty about the consequences of his choices, and their distress was genuine, even though it was based on a misunderstanding of what was really happening. David helped me recognize that giving in to this pressure would undo all the progress we had made in establishing healthier family dynamics. Jessica, if you pay for Tyler's vacation now, you'll be proving that his manipulation strategies still work. He'll learn that he just needs to create enough emotional distress for other family members to get what he wants. The insight was crucial because it helped me understand that this wasn't just about one vacation or even about the money involved. This was about whether Tyler would learn that his behavior had real consequences, or whether he would learn that he could always find a way around accountability if he was persistent enough in his manipulation. I made the decision to maintain my boundaries regardless of the emotional consequences. Tyler would not be joining us in Cabo unless he could pay his own way, and I would not subsidize his vacation expenses directly or indirectly. When I communicated this decision to my parents, their disappointment was profound. They had been looking forward to this family vacation for months, and Tyler's absence would fundamentally change the nature of the experience they had planned. But I also sensed a grudging respect for my consistency in maintaining the boundaries I had established. My father, in particular, seemed to understand that caving to Tyler's manipulation at this point would undermine everything we had tried to accomplish in our earlier confrontation. The week before departure was filled with tension and sadness, as my parents struggled to adjust their expectations for the vacation. They went through the stages of grief as they realized that their vision of a perfect family getaway was not going to materialize. Tyler, meanwhile, attempted several last-minute strategies to change the outcome. He suggested that he could join us for part of the trip if someone else could cover the initial expenses, or that he could come along and work off his debt through various services during the vacation. Each suggestion represented a new attempt to avoid taking full responsibility for his circumstances while still gaining access to the vacation he wanted. I refused all of these proposals, recognizing them as variations on the same manipulative themes that had characterized Tyler's behavior for years. 3 days before our departure, Tyler made one final attempt that was both more desperate and more revealing than his previous efforts. He called me in tears, claiming that his exclusion from the family vacation was causing him to have serious thoughts about self-harm, and that he needed the trip as a way to reconnect with family support systems. The emotional manipulation was transparent but still effective in creating anxiety and guilt. Tyler was essentially threatening to harm himself if I didn't give him what he wanted, which represented an escalation in his manipulation tactics that felt genuinely concerning. I consulted with David and decided to take Tyler's claims seriously while still maintaining my boundaries. I encouraged him to seek professional mental health support and offered to help him find resources, but I made it clear that manipulative threats would not change my position about the vacation expenses. Tyler's response to my offer of mental health resources revealed the calculated nature of his emotional appeals. When I suggested specific therapists and support programs, he quickly backed away from his claims of crisis and returned to arguing about the unfairness of the financial expectations. The incident crystallized my understanding of how sophisticated Tyler's manipulation had become, and how important it was to maintain clear boundaries regardless of the emotional pressure he applied. Giving in to threats of self-harm would establish a precedent that would make future manipulation even more extreme and difficult to resist. As our departure date approached, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief about Tyler's absence from the vacation. The sadness was genuine. I had hoped that our family could find a way to enjoy this experience together while still maintaining healthy boundaries and expectations. But the relief was equally real. The vacation would allow David and me to spend time with my parents, without the constant tension and manipulation that Tyler's presence would have created. It would also demonstrate to my parents what family interactions could feel like when they weren't constantly managing Tyler's emotional demands and financial crises. The night before our departure, my mother called to express her continued sadness about Tyler's absence, but also to acknowledge that she was beginning to understand why I had insisted on maintaining boundaries. Jessica, I still wish things could have worked out differently, but I'm starting to see that helping Tyler avoid consequences hasn't actually helped him become more responsible. Maybe this experience will motivate him to make some real changes. Her comment suggested that the crisis had created an opportunity for my parents to examine their own role in enabling Tyler's irresponsible behavior. The vacation would be different from what they had originally envisioned, But it might also be the beginning of healthier family dynamics that were based on honesty and accountability, rather than manipulation and enabling. As David and I finished packing for Cabo, I reflected on how much had changed since that initial family dinner where the vacation had first been proposed. What had started as a simple disagreement about financial contributions had evolved into a comprehensive reckoning with years of dysfunctional family patterns. The outcome hadn't been what anyone had originally wanted, but it represented the first time in my adult life that I had successfully maintained boundaries with my family despite intense pressure to abandon them. The vacation would be a test of whether this new dynamic could create space for more authentic and healthier relationships going forward. The plane touched down in Cabo San Lucas under a brilliant blue sky that seemed to promise exactly the kind of relaxing family vacation my parents had envisioned when they first planned this trip. David and I collected our luggage and made our way through the airport, where my parents were waiting with expressions that mixed excitement about the vacation with lingering sadness about Tyler's absence. The resort they had chosen was everything they had described during that fateful family dinner weeks earlier. Sprawling grounds dotted with palm trees and tropical flowers led down to a pristine beach where turquoise waves lapped against white sand. The lobby was an open-air design that captured ocean breezes and framed spectacular views of the coastline. As we checked into our adjoining suites, I couldn't help but think about how different this experience felt from what I had originally anticipated. The absence of Tyler's drama and manipulation had created space for a kind of family interaction that I wasn't sure we had ever experienced before. My parents seemed to be processing their own mixed emotions about Tyler's absence. They had spent so many years managing his crises and accommodating his needs that they appeared almost uncertain about how to enjoy a vacation without those familiar sources of stress and responsibility. Our first evening together was revelatory, in ways I hadn't expected. Without Tyler dominating conversations with his latest schemes or financial emergencies, we were able to talk about other topics that had been crowded out of our family discussions for years. My father shared stories about his retirement plans and his interest in woodworking projects. My mother talked about books she was reading and volunteer work she was considering. David and I found ourselves learning things about my parents that had been obscured by the constant focus on Tyler's problems. They were intelligent, interesting people with their own dreams and concerns, but those qualities had been overshadowed by their role as Tyler's primary support system and crisis managers. During dinner at the resort's oceanfront restaurant, my mother made an observation that surprised all of us. I can't remember the last time we had a family conversation that didn't revolve around Tyler's latest emergency or opportunity. This feels like what family dinners used to be like when you kids were younger. Her comment revealed how completely Tyler's manipulation had dominated our family dynamics in recent years. Even my parents were beginning to recognize how much energy and attention had been diverted toward managing his behavior, rather than nurturing the relationships with family members who weren't constantly in crisis. My father nodded in agreement with my mother's observation. "Jessica, I owe you an apology for not recognizing sooner how Tyler's behavior was affecting you and our family. I think we got so focused on trying to help him that we lost sight of what was fair to everyone else." The apology was more meaningful than I had expected, because it came without any prompting or pressure from me. My father had used the peaceful environment of the vacation to reflect on the family dynamics that had led to our recent conflict, and he was acknowledging his own role in enabling problematic behavior. "Dad, I appreciate that, but I don't think any of us understood how seriously dysfunctional things had become until Tyler's deception was exposed. We were all just trying to be supportive family members, and it took time to recognize that what we thought was support was actually enabling harmful behavior." The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we had ever had. Instead of focusing on immediate problems or crises, we were able to examine the patterns and assumptions that had shaped our relationships for years. My parents shared their own frustrations with Tyler's behavior and their confusion about how to help him without making things worse. David's contributions to these conversations were particularly valuable because his outside perspective helped us see dynamics that had become invisible to us through familiarity. He asked thoughtful questions about how our family had developed certain patterns and whether those patterns were serving everyone's best interests. By the third day of our vacation, something had shifted in my relationship with my parents. The constant tension and vigilance that had characterized our recent interactions had been replaced by a sense of genuine connection and mutual respect. They were treating me as an adult with valid perspectives, rather than as someone whose concerns needed to be managed or minimized. The breakthrough moment came during a sunset walk along the beach, when my mother brought up the topic of Tyler's future and our family's role in supporting him. Instead of making excuses for his behavior or suggesting that I should be more forgiving, she asked genuine questions about what kind of help might actually benefit Tyler in the long run. Jessica, I've been thinking about what you said regarding enabling versus helping. I'm starting to understand that protecting Tyler from consequences hasn't actually protected him from anything. It's just delayed the point where he would need to develop real coping skills and work ethic. Her insight represented a fundamental shift in thinking that had been developing throughout our vacation. The peaceful environment and Tyler's absence had created space for my parents to examine their parenting strategies and consider whether their approaches had been truly helpful. Mom, I think Tyler is capable of much more than any of us have expected from him. But as long as he knows that family members will rescue him from his poor choices, he doesn't have any incentive to develop the skills he needs for genuine independence. The conversation that followed was emotional but productive. My parents shared their fears about Tyler's ability to succeed without family support, and I was able to help them understand that their support had actually been preventing him from discovering his own capabilities. David suggested that Tyler's situation might improve significantly if he were required to demonstrate responsibility and accountability as prerequisites for family assistance, rather than receiving help regardless of his behavior. The idea of conditional support felt foreign to my parents initially, but they were beginning to see how unconditional support had enabled destructive patterns. As the vacation progressed, I noticed that my parents were beginning to enjoy themselves in ways that seemed unfamiliar to them. They were relaxed and spontaneous, taking advantage of resort activities and excursions without constantly worrying about Tyler's welfare or feeling guilty about enjoying experiences he couldn't afford. My father, in particular, seemed to be rediscovering interests and enthusiasms that had been submerged under years of stress about Tyler's problems. He signed up for a fishing charter and spent hours talking with other guests about retirement plans and hobbies. His energy and engagement reminded me of aspects of his personality that I had forgotten existed. My mother was having her own revelations about what life could feel like without constant crisis management. She spent mornings reading by the pool, joined a resort cooking class, and even signed up for a dance lesson with my father. The lightness in her demeanor was striking contrast to the worried tension that had characterized her interactions during recent family gatherings. On our fourth day in Cabo, I made a decision that would fundamentally alter the entire trajectory of our family vacation and potentially our relationships forever. While my parents were at the spa and David was reading by the pool, I pulled out my laptop and began researching luxury accommodations in the area. If my family wanted to play games with financial expectations and double standards, I was ready to show them exactly what those games looked like when someone else held the cards. The Esperanza Resort caught my attention immediately. Located on a private peninsula just 15 minutes from where we were staying, it was the kind of ultra-luxury destination that celebrities and business moguls chose when they wanted complete privacy and unparalleled service. The Penthouse suite featured a private infinity pool, personal butler service, a fully equipped kitchen, and panoramic views of the Sea of Cortez that looked like something from a travel magazine. More importantly, the Penthouse was available for the remaining 3 nights of our stay, and the cost was exactly what I needed to make my point. $15,000 for 3 nights was more than my parents had budgeted for their entire week-long vacation, but it was well within my means and would serve as a perfect demonstration of what financial independence actually looked like. I made the reservation without discussing it with David or my parents, knowing that hesitation or consultation would only give me time to talk myself out of what I was beginning to realize was a necessary statement about respect and boundaries. When David returned from the pool, I calmly informed him that we would be checking out of our current suite and moving to new accommodations for the remainder of our stay. His initial confusion quickly gave way to curiosity as I explained my plan and the reasoning behind it. Jessica, are you sure this is the message you want to send? It's going to create a lot of drama, and probably hurt your parents' feelings. His concern was valid, but I had reached a point where protecting other people's feelings seemed less important than protecting my own dignity and self-respect. David, my parents have spent years expecting me to subsidize Tyler's lifestyle while treating my financial success as a reason why I should pay more than my fair share for everything. Maybe it's time they understood exactly how much financial flexibility I actually have. The conversation with my parents an hour later was everything I had expected and more. When I announced that David and I would be leaving the resort to stay elsewhere for the remainder of our vacation, their initial reaction was shock and confusion. "Jessica, what's wrong with our accommodations? I thought you were enjoying the resort," my mother said, her voice carrying the kind of worried tone that suggested she sensed this decision was about more than just hotel preferences. "There's nothing wrong with the resort, Mom. I just decided that since I'm apparently the family member who's expected to pay premium prices for everything, I might as well enjoy premium experiences. I've booked the Penthouse suite at Esperanza for the next 3 nights." The silence that followed was profound. My father's expression shifted from confusion to understanding as he began to grasp the implications of what I was saying. My mother appeared to be processing the financial reality of my decision and what it suggested about my income and spending capacity. "Jessica, honey, how much is this penthouse costing?" my mother asked hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. $15,000 for 3 nights. "But don't worry about it, Mom. According to the family logic, since I'm doing well financially, I should be happy to spend whatever it takes to ensure everyone has a good time." My father cleared his throat and attempted to address what he was beginning to recognize as justified anger about our family's financial dynamics. "Jessica, if this is about Tyler's vacation expenses, we can work something out. Maybe we can split his costs among all of us." The suggestion revealed how completely my parents had missed the point of everything that had happened over the past few weeks. They were still thinking in terms of managing immediate financial arrangements, rather than addressing the underlying attitudes and expectations that had created the problem. "Dad, this isn't about Tyler's vacation costs. This is about the fact that our family operates under a system where my financial success is treated as a family resource rather than a personal achievement. Tyler gets free vacations because he's struggling, while I get to pay premium prices because I'm successful. I've decided to embrace that logic completely." David had been quietly observing the conversation, but he stepped in with a perspective that helped clarify what was really happening. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, I think Jessica is trying to show you what it looks like when someone with financial resources chooses to prioritize their own comfort and preferences, rather than subsidizing other people's experiences." His explanation was diplomatically worded but devastatingly accurate. I had spent years using my financial success to enhance other people's lives, while accepting lower standards for myself in the name of family harmony. The penthouse represented a complete reversal of those priorities. My mother's reaction revealed how uncomfortable she was with the implications of my decision. "Jessica, we never expected you to sacrifice your own comfort for the family. We've always tried to treat everyone fairly." The claim about fair treatment was so disconnected from reality that I felt compelled to provide specific examples of how our family's financial arrangements actually worked. "Mom, let me explain how this vacation was supposed to work. Tyler gets a free trip because he's going through a tough time. I pay $6,500 for accommodations that Tyler rejected as insufficient for his needs. Meanwhile, I'm supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to subsidize his luxury vacation while accepting whatever arrangements you decided were adequate for the paying customers." The detailed breakdown of the vacation's financial structure made it impossible for my parents to maintain the fiction that everyone was being treated equally. Tyler's absence from the trip hadn't eliminated the problematic assumptions that had shaped the original arrangements. It had simply made those assumptions more visible. My father attempted to minimize the significance of the financial disparities by focusing on family relationships rather than money. "Jessica, we're not trying to take advantage of you. We just wanted everyone to be able to enjoy this vacation together, and we thought you wouldn't mind helping make that possible." His response demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that had enabled years of financial exploitation. My success was being treated as a family asset that could be deployed to solve other people's problems, while my own preferences and boundaries were considered secondary to maintaining group harmony. Dad, the problem isn't that I minded helping. The problem is that help was expected rather than requested, and that my financial contributions were taken for granted rather than appreciated. When someone assumes that your success obligates you to subsidize their lifestyle, that's not family support. That's exploitation. The word exploitation seemed to hit my parents like a physical blow. They had been thinking of their expectations as reasonable family dynamics, but my characterization forced them to confront the possibility that they had been taking advantage of my generosity and success. David and I excused ourselves to pack our belongings and arrange transportation to Esperanza. The process of moving from one resort to another felt symbolic of a larger transition in my relationship with my family. I was choosing to prioritize my own preferences and comfort rather than accepting whatever arrangements other people decided were sufficient. The Esperanza penthouse exceeded every expectation I had developed based on the online photos and descriptions. The private infinity pool seemed to flow directly into the ocean beyond, creating the illusion of swimming in the Sea of Cortez itself. The butler, Carlos, welcomed us with champagne and a detailed explanation of the services and amenities available during our stay. The contrast with our previous accommodations was dramatic. But more importantly, the psychological impact of choosing luxury for myself, rather than subsidizing other people's experiences, was transformative. For the first time in years, I was experiencing what it felt like to use my financial success entirely for my own benefit. David's reaction to the penthouse captured the significance of what was happening. Jessica, this is incredible, but I have to ask, are you doing this to prove a point to your family? Or are you doing this because you actually want to enjoy these experiences? His question forced me to examine my own motivations more carefully. While the penthouse had initially been chosen as a statement about family dynamics, I was discovering that I genuinely enjoyed having access to this level of luxury and service. The realization that I had been consistently choosing moderation and compromise rather than fully embracing what my success could provide was both surprising and liberating. David, I think I'm doing this for both reasons. I wanted to show my family what it looks like when I stop prioritizing everyone else's comfort over my own, but I'm also discovering that I actually like living well and experiencing the best that money can buy. That evening, as we enjoyed a private dinner prepared by the resort's executive chef and served on our terrace overlooking the ocean, I reflected on how different this experience felt from the family vacation I had originally anticipated. Instead of managing Tyler's drama and accommodating my parents' expectations, I was able to focus entirely on enjoying David's company and the luxury that my hard work had made possible. My parents called several times throughout the evening, initially to check on our accommodations and later to suggest that we meet for drinks or dinner. I politely declined each invitation, explaining that David and I were enjoying the privacy and exclusivity that we had paid for. The psychological shift was profound. Instead of feeling guilty about choosing luxury while my parents stayed at a more modest resort, I felt proud of my success and confident in my decision to prioritize my own preferences. The years of using my resources to subsidize other people's lifestyles had created a pattern where I automatically assumed that modest accommodations were appropriate for me, while luxury was reserved for people whose needs were considered more important. Our final day in Cabo was spent entirely at Esperanza, taking advantage of every amenity and service that the penthouse offered. We had couples massages by the pool, took a private yacht excursion that included gourmet lunch and premium cocktails, and ended the day with a sunset dinner that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. When my parents called to coordinate departure logistics, I could hear the hurt and confusion in their voices. They had expected this luxury interlude to be a temporary statement that would end with reconciliation and a return to normal family dynamics. Jessica, we need to talk about what happened this week. I don't think any of us understood how angry you were about the vacation arrangements, and we want to find a way to address your concerns. My mother's attempt at reconciliation was well-intentioned, but it revealed that she still didn't understand the fundamental nature of the problem. This wasn't about vacation arrangements or temporary anger. It was about a complete reevaluation of how I wanted to live and what kind of relationships I was willing to accept. Mom, I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful. This experience has helped me understand that I've been selling myself short by always choosing accommodation and compromise over pursuing what I actually want. I'm planning to make some significant changes in how I approach relationships and lifestyle choices. The conversation that followed was difficult, but necessary. I explained that I would no longer be available to subsidize other people's lifestyle choices, or to accept double standards that treated my success as a family resource rather than a personal achievement. The changes I was describing would affect much more than just vacation planning. They would reshape every aspect of how I interacted with family members who had become accustomed to my accommodation and generosity. Flying home from Cabo, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. The penthouse had been expensive, but it had provided invaluable insight into what I actually wanted from life and relationships. I was done accepting less than I deserved in the name of family harmony. The transformation wasn't just about money or luxury. It was about recognizing that my success and generosity should be appreciated rather than taken for granted. The family members who could adapt to this new dynamic would be welcome in my life, while those who couldn't would need to accept more limited relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. David and I spent the flight planning other experiences and purchases that would reflect our actual financial capacity rather than the modest lifestyle I had chosen to avoid making other people feel uncomfortable. The penthouse had been a revelation about possibilities I had been denying myself in service of other people's comfort and expectations. 6 months later, when Tyler finally completed his transformation and began making genuine efforts to rebuild our relationship based on honesty and accountability, he visited David and me at our new home, a luxury condo with amenities that reflected our actual income rather than our previous commitment to modest living. Tyler's reaction to our upgraded lifestyle was telling. Instead of expressing resentment or entitlement, he seemed genuinely impressed by what hard work and responsible financial management could achieve. The penthouse experience had established a new baseline for how I expected to live, and Tyler's respect for that choice became one of the foundations for our improved relationship. The Cabo penthouse had cost $15,000 for 3 nights, but it had provided insights worth far more than that investment. Sometimes you need to experience what you're capable of having in order to understand what you're willing to accept. The luxury was nice, but the self-respect was invaluable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.